So far in asymmetric information, what we did was we saw that asymmetric information can lead to welfare losses. So in case of adverse selection, for instance, too little of the high quality service, high quality product is sold in equilibrium. So we saw, for instance, the second-hand car market where the good cars didn't get sold, even though there were potential buyers who wanted to pay a high price, and the price would have made the potential sellers of good cars happy. Still, the transaction didn't take place, which was a welfare loss. In the insurance market, we saw that the low-risk person ended up possibly not buying the insurance policy because they thought the insurance policy premiums are too high because they happen to be low risk, but the insurance company couldn't tell who's high risk, who's low risk, and therefore couldn't provide a good insurance premium. If the insurance company had full information, then it would have been able, we would have been able to see a transaction between them, improving the welfare for the economy. There would have been an expected profit for the insurance company and expected increase in expected utility for the person who's insured. In credit markets, we saw that it's possible that somebody who's a good quality applicant simply does not get the loan from the bank, even though if there was no asymmetric information, that good business idea could have been put to use, which would have benefited not only the bank, not only the applicant, but the whole society. We even talked about a restaurant who's starting to think about providing a really high quality service, really good quality food, but because there is informational asymmetry, they were thinking that they're not going to be able to provide that high quality good, which would mean charging high prices for the menu items, and customer not knowing for sure that it's a good quality restaurant wouldn't want to pay for it. But we also saw that the market came up with some solutions to these adverse selection welfare problems. So in the car market, we said mechanics have information, take the car to the mechanic, information problem solved. In insurance markets, we said the insurance companies could charge premium based on your history. If you are the type of person who has a lot of car accidents, then they're going to charge a higher premium. So looking at the history gives some of the information that is required to assess your risk levels. And in credit markets, we saw the Yunus's microcredit that solves some of the asymmetric information problem by making people come together when they are applying for a loan. In restaurant business, we thought of standardization like McDonald's does, and we also talked about more of a dynamic game where we have reputation building over time, and we could also think about return policies, for instance. So today, we're starting another solution that's offered. This is another guy with a Nobel Prize. But before I start my new topic, I'll ask you if anyone so far has any questions. It's all clear? Lovely. So this was all summary so far. From here on, it's a new topic. We want to talk about Spence. Spence is the second guy that shared the Nobel Prize with Akerlof. So it's Stiglitz, Joe Stiglitz, Spence, and Akerlof. Spence is the second guy we want to talk about about asymmetric information. And the topic is called signaling. Signaling is a way of solving this asymmetric information problem. And Spence starts with a very basic question, which ended up getting really, I mean, he's a very prolific guy. He wrote a lot, but if he didn't write this paper, I don't think he was going to get the Nobel Prize. He starts with the question of, you are going to the job market. And you don't start out with a big CV, you're just getting out of school. And the employer knows that some potential workers are not of good quality and some of them are higher quality. So they're looking for productive workers, productive employees. But all there is a CV, a piece of paper that you can show, and an interview. And well, what can you say in an interview? Really not much. Having been in many interviews at this point, I can tell you it's mostly telling you about the self-confidence of the individual. And sure, self-confidence takes you a long way in some of the businesses, but really, you can't really tell a whole lot from an interview. So Spence asks the following question. given that there is asymmetric information, that is, the potential employer does not know whether you are a good quality employee or a employee candidate, or whether you are a bad quality employee candidate, what can you do to differentiate yourself from the others? How can you convey the information to the firm that you're the good guy, that the firm should hire you? How are you going to do that? How can you signal that you're a high quality material, that you're going to be a good employee? This is the question Spence asks. What do you think? Do you have any ideas? I think you do, because you are in front of me and you're college students. So Spence's answer is going to be education. And he has a very simplistic model. And you are second year students, by now you know about modeling in economics. We take an idea and we strip it down to the very, very main ingredients. So there is a story and we think about what is the driving factor in the story. And now we simplify everything else to be able to get to that driving factor, to be able to tell our story effectively. And for this reason, Spence makes the following assumption, crazy assumption, but it's okay, because even if we were to relax this assumption, his model would still go. But his very, very crazy assumption is that we're going to assume education does not improve a person's productivity in the workplace. Okay, so this is the starting point. Let me say it again. When the firm is hiring you, they do not care whether you have studied about asymmetric information, whether you studied butterflies or how the cell is dividing, or whether you studied how the forward markets work. Okay? They are just things that you studied, and the firm does not think that anything that you studied in school is going to improve productivity. So under this very, very restrictive sort of assumption, not realistic assumption, of course education does improve your human resource quality, but imagine that there is no input of education into your productivity in the workplace. Would there be any room for education in that case? Would we still see college education? Would we still see postgrad degrees? So the employer knows that you're never going to use derivatives, you're never going to use integrals. Would the employer then look at your math score? What do you think? Spence says yes. And so I'm going to tell you the story of Spence, the signaling game, education. First tell the story, and then I'm going to use the slides and tell it one more time. But first I want to give you the spirit of the story before I go through with a numerical example. Any questions so far? Okay. Okay, so the thing is, we're going to assume that whatever makes you find easy to go to school, whatever character qualities, character features makes it easy for a person to be successful academically, are also the character traits that are needed to be successful in the workplace. So for instance, if you're a quick learner, you don't know a software that you need to use, you go to Google, you get these help videos, you read a little bit, you teach it to yourself, well, you're going to do well in college. In college, there's a lot of self-learning. But that's exactly the same skill that is necessary in the workplace. If you're the type of person who is organized, who is good with time management, then you're going to be able to submit your work at deadlines, before the deadline, and so you're going to get good scores for your assignments. So what makes you successful academically, that is being a good time management person, making projects online, is exactly what the employer needs in the workplace as well. If you are a social sort of type who gets together with the other students, sets up networks, social networks, I don't know, WhatsApp chat groups, etc., then when you miss a class, you have people to go to and ask for help. You say, I missed that lecture. I looked at the lecture notes. I didn't understand anything. Would you be able to help me? That means you're able to work with other people. And that's exactly what the employer wants from you in the workplace. So you see, whatever makes you successful in school is also what makes you successful in the workplace. That's why, for instance, they started caring about, they keep saying, in school you should give a lot of teamwork, group projects. Because if you're good with dealing with team projects, you know how to organize people, you know how to deal with free riders, you know how to deal with people who are a little bit too much dominant in a project, then that feature is going to be making you successful in group projects. It's also going to make you successful in the workplace. So it's not that you have learned what Akerlof said in the Lemons Market. It's not that you have learned the rate of cell division. It's not that you have learned how to take interviews. But it's that while you were doing this in school, you needed all these character traits to be able to make you successful. And it is these character traits that the employer wants. And it is these character traits that make it easy for you to get education. Okay? So it's possible for a person who's not a very quick learner to do college, but it's more costly. It might take not 3 years, but 4 years. It might take a lot of tutoring. It might take a lot of repeating the classes and not being able to do a summer job. So it's possible that a person who doesn't have these other character traits that make it easy to succeed academically to do college, but it's more costly for them. So what does the employer do? The employer says, well, I don't really care what they have studied, but have they been successful in school? How many years did they study in school? And that can give me a signal about their character traits. So I'm going to decide on a threshold, and I'm going to put on a job opening advertisement, and then I'm going to tell my admin assistant, well, this is the threshold. Tell me the people who pass this education threshold, and I will be paying them this amount of money if they will be doing this sort of job. And if they didn't pass that threshold, I'll be thinking for them for a different sort of job, which will pay much lower. So now, as a young person, you know that if you were to get education, then you would be able to signal the employer that you're a good quality worker, in which case you would get the high wages. But even if you were a lower quality employee, even if you weren't academically inclined, you could still get education. But it would be a whole lot more cost for you. So you may choose not to get education. So in a signaling model, for a signal to actually work for conveying quality in an asymmetric information environment, it must be that it is cheaper for the high quality applicant, for the high quality goods, sometimes we talk about goods, for the high quality to give the signal compared to the low quality. The low quality can choose to give the signal if it wants, but it's going to cost them a whole lot more. So in a signaling model, for the signal to work to convey information, it must be that the low type and the high type separate in equilibrium, that they do different things. In this case, that the low type chooses not to get education, and the high type chooses to get education, even though the low type knows that it would have gotten the high wages if it were to get education, but getting education is so costly for the low type that the low type would rather not get educated in the first place. So what that means is very drastic actually in Spence's model, because Spence assumed in his simple model that education does not increase a person's productivity in the workplace directly. It means all that education that people go through is simply for signaling. So it's simply so many years in education, the undergrad, the postgrad, possibly the PhD, all that education in Spence's model is the cost of signaling to be able to convince the employer that you are the high quality type, so that the employer chooses to hire you over the other guy. Okay, so I'll give you a few seconds to think about this while I share my document and go through the same story, but with slides this time. Meanwhile, you can ask questions. Folks, do you see the slides?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, so Spence's market signaling, as I said, he shared the prize with Akerlof. Akerlof is the main guy who came up with the idea, and Spence brought it to microeconomics. And there are very many applications of signaling in the literature, and I'm going to mention a few. But we're going to first talk about the original paper. And the original paper starts out with the question of how do workers let employers know that they are productive so that they will be hired. The workers know that there is asymmetric information. Just through an interview, the employer is unable to tell who is what type of employee. Therefore, there is the question of how do you convince the employer that you're good quality so that they do hire you. Okay, so for the signal to be effective, and in this case, signal will be the level of education. For the signal to be effective, the signal must be easier for the productive people to give and not so easy for the non-productive people to give. So in this case, our productive people are people who are also academically inclined. Academically inclined people who turn out to be also productive in the workplace. And so the academically inclined people find school not all that hard, so it's not costly for them to get the education, but the academically not so inclined people, yeah, they can get education. They might choose to get education, but it's going to be a whole lot harder for them. It's going to be a whole lot more costly for them. So the simplifying assumptions of the model is going to be that education does not change productivity, but productivity at workplace is correlated with academic achievement due to character traits. Whatever character traits make it so that you are successful academically are also the same sort of character traits that are going to make you productive in the workplace. And it's easier for productive people to have the academic achievements. So this is the cost issue that I was talking about. So here is a numerical example that will make things very easy for you to understand, I think. We're going to have two groups of people. Group A are going to be people who are academically inclined. So for these people, going to school is not too hard. They manage school without going into big efforts or I don't know, it doesn't take them too long to study, etc. Group B people, however, are not as academically inclined. And the cost of attending school for these two groups of people are different. For Group A, it's going to be 3,000 times E, where E is the number of school years. Okay. So if you go to school for 10 years, it's going to be 30,000 euro. If you go to school for 15 years, it's going to be 45,000 euro. Of course, this doesn't have to be in euro. It could be measured in opportunity cost. It could be psychological cost. It could be everything altogether. It could include the tutoring costs. It could include all sorts of costs, all symbolized into monetary terms. And the B type, their cost is higher. For them, it's 4,000 times E. So each year of education costs them more, either because it's so much more stressful and their hair gets white before it gets white for the type A people. They might get the ulcers, they might get, I don't know, as I said, have to do repeat classes every year, so their summer gets ruined, whatever it is, but it's more costly for the B type. Any questions so far? No questions. It's nice and pretty model. Okay, so here, firms will be reading the signal of education and pay each group accordingly. So the firm is going to offer 30,000 euro if the education level of a particular candidate is less than E star. So this E star is going to be our threshold. Did you get education less than E star? Then you're going to go for a job for 30,000 euro. But if you got education equal or greater than E star, you're going to land in a job that will give you 90,000 euro. So for education, to serve as a signal for productivity, we wonder what is the minimum E star, what is the minimum threshold level of education the employer should set. Okay. What level of education should the employer set so that this level of employment actually gives the employer information about who is in which group. So for education to serve as a signal in equilibrium, we need to have the two groups behave differently in equilibrium. So we need to have a separating signal in equilibrium, or else either everybody will get an education greater or equal to E star, or nobody will get education as high as E star, in which case when the employer looks at the workers, the employer keeps seeing exactly the same level of employment, and so that employment ends up not serving any informational signaling quality. It's only if people end up self-selecting themselves into two different groups will we see signaling working as a information gathering mechanism. So here I should have written self-selection. So you might want to take a note of this. The people need to self-select themselves in equilibrium so that we can talk about signaling in equilibrium. If the E star, if the threshold is set at a wrong level, that self-selection is not going to happen, and therefore education will not provide information to the employer about who is high quality, who is low quality. So we need to have group A people. They're going to find education pays off, that it's good to get education because of this higher pay in the future, and they will obtain the education E star, and surely they will not obtain a higher education than E star because let's say E star is 15 years. If I show that to the employer that I'm already in education for 15 years, I already convinced the employer that I'm good quality candidate, why would I get 16 years? Given that education itself does not increase my productivity, I'm never going to go above the threshold. And people in group B will find that education does not pay enough, and they will choose not to obtain education. And these people, in the simple model, not in real life, but in the simple model, are going to get zero education. Of course, everybody has to read and write and all that sort of thing, and the government imposes restrictions about how many years of education you need to have. But just for this modeling exercise, you can realize that the worker either goes for hitting the threshold to be able to convince the employer that they are of good quality, or the employer does not hit the threshold, and since in this case education does not improve productivity, then they are going to get zero education. Okay, so now I'm going to see what are the requirements for these two things to hold at the same time. So let's look at group A first. If group A receives no education, they receive 30,000 euro. That was the strategy we told for the firm. We said the firm tells the administrative assistant to check the threshold, the education level of the worker, potential worker, and if it crosses the threshold, then give them 90,000. If it doesn't, then give them 30,000. So if group A person does not get education, then they are going to receive 30,000. If they receive education, in that case, they are going to get 90,000. That's good news, but the bad news is education comes at a cost. For group A people, the cost is 3,000 times E star. Because if you're going to get education, you might as well hit the target, E star, and you're not going to get more. So that means as long as getting education has higher expected value than not getting education, then group A people will receive education. So if 90,000 minus the cost of getting education, 3,000 times E star, the left-hand side here, is greater than or equal to 30,000, which is what group A people would receive if they don't get education, then they will go ahead and receive education. And if I solve for E star, what I find is, as long as E star, this threshold that the employer sets, is less than or equal to 20 years of education, then type A person prefers to receive education. If E star is greater than 20 years, then type A person does not want to receive education. Yes, it would go from 30,000 to 90,000, the payment, but it's not worth it because it's so costly. But as long as E star is less than or equal to 20, type A is going to receive education. Now, as you can imagine, we're going to do the same thing for type B. Any questions so far? It's all clear? Okay. So group B, we're going to do the same thing. If group B receives no education, group B receives 30,000 euro. With education, they are going to receive 90,000. But that will come at a cost of 4,000 times E star. So let's look at the left-hand side. This is what happens to group B if they get education. 90,000 minus the cost of getting the education E star, for 40,000 times E star. If that is less than or equal to 30,000, which is what they get if they don't get education, then group B people will not receive education. They will prefer not to receive education. And when I solve this inequality for E star, I find that as long as E star is greater than or equal to 15 years, type B person will prefer not to receive education. So I did exactly the same thing as I did before, except that I used the different cost functions for type A and type B people. So let's now put it all together. We're ready to put it all together. If E star is less than or equal to 20, then type A person prefers to receive education. If E star is above 15 years, then type B person prefers not to receive education. So now we can talk about the different equilibria we are going to observe. If the threshold is set less than 15 years of education, both type A and type B will receive education. In that case, will education serve as a signal for quality? If E star is set to be less than 15 years of education, both type A and type B receive education. In that case, would education serve as a signal of quality? Anyone? Let's check the messages. Nope. Well, you know, if this was a SCORM package, this would have been a question in your SCORM package. Let me say it again. If E star is set to be less than 15 years, both type A and type B would receive education. In that case, would education serve as a signal for quality for the applicants? The answer is no. Very good, thank you, Louis. The answer is no, because they're both getting education. Both the high quality and low quality gets education. So as an employer, I have no idea. If the E star is set greater than 20 years, so if a person has more than 20 years of education, I'm going to pay them 90,000. Otherwise, I'm going to pay them 30,000. In that case, nobody receives education. Nobody receives education. So in that case, also, education does not serve as a signal for quality. Because I set an E star, a threshold that is, for instance, 22 years, and I look at it, not a single CV shows me 22 years of education. The bad, the low quality and the high quality, nobody has 22 years of education. So that sort of a strategy for me would have been completely useless. Education would not serve as a signal. But here is where the action comes. If E star is set between 15 years and 20 years, then type B people choose not to get education. Because the most they would study would have been 15 years to be able to move from a pay of 30,000 to 90,000. But type A people would choose to get education because it's less costly for them to get education. And so if I set an education E star, I say 16 years, then yes, education will serve as a signal of quality, because people, low type and high type, are going to self-select themselves into getting educated and not educated. For the low type, they will choose not to get educated, even though they could if they wanted to, but it's too costly. And the high type will choose to get educated because it's worth getting the education to move from the low pay to high pay because their cost of education isn't too much. And this separating equilibrium, in equilibrium, the low type and the high type have different strategies in equilibrium. The separating equilibrium makes it so that education is a signal for quality. So the minimum education level that the firm needs to set to be able to tell the productive applicant from the not productive applicant is 16 years in this problem. And in this very simplistic, crazy problem, as you can see, solving the asymmetric information problem is very, very costly. These people are going to go through 16 years of education, not because education improves productivity, but to be able to signal to the employer that they should be hired at a high wage rate because they are going to be productive people. So yes, asymmetric information problem can be solved in this case, but it comes at a very large cost. Of course, in reality, education does improve productivity, so this is not a very realistic sort of model, but I think it's a very nice model in giving us a very stark result with a very, very simple structure.